very compartmentalised. I sort of had my career, which in those days was before I took up counselling and psychotherapy, was furniture design and making things, working with my hands. I had my family, which was a very important part of my life, and I had my Buddhist interests. So I can't be called a schizophrenic. It was sort of three sections of life, and I would find myself in one world thinking this is the world I should be in, and then I'd go into another world and think, no, this is the world I should be in, and it would happen to all three worlds. A bit disorientating. So with time, I sort of found my way in the world and decided that counselling and psychotherapy interested me a great deal, and plunged into that. And now, entering that world, one enters the world of the mind. But the mind is understood until now very much in Western terms as the psychological realm, which of course Buddha Dhamma does address, but it addresses it in the context of a very specific path towards realization. At the same time, the world that is explored by counselling and psychotherapy is very valid, but it doesn't, unless one goes into the transpersonal fields, touch on the issues of who one is on a sort of existential level necessarily, and certainly tends to generally avoid religious aspects of a path of inquiry. In fact, it's rather frowned on. So when I was going through my counselling and then later psychotherapeutic training, it was a bit of a taboo subject, religion, because people were fearful of being preached to or talked to, converted. So it was a subject that became a bit of a taboo subject. So my practice in those days really consisted in going on retreats and doing a lot of reading. I was very interested in anything to do with the field of the call it the big mind, Buddha mind. And I had to find a vocabulary which somehow bridged the gap between these two worlds. My training was primarily psychodynamic. Now, psychodynamic training is very interested in looking at why we are the way we are. And so what it tends to do is, in Buddhist terms, it looks at the idappaccayata, which means the cause and effect chain of phenomena. So in other words, with the help of history taking and hearing the life story of an individual, one can see the various influences that affect a person's personality and how they see the world. And this is sort of a very useful way of mapping a person's personality structure. So although it can, and I would go on retreats and often find therapy criticized, for instance, even by monks, who sort of tend to dismiss it a little bit. That's the impression I had. At the same time, I couldn't refute the value of understanding what previous causes in one's family or society have affected the way that one functions. And in fact, if one does see it in terms of cause and effect, it corresponds very beautifully with the Buddhist analysis. You know, even the Buddha did his own version of idappaccayata in terms of cause and effect, except he didn't do it just in one lifetime. He actually looked at many, many lifetimes, saw the cause and chain of his becoming Siddhartha Gautama, who then became the Buddha through his realization. What we work with in psychotherapy and counselling, of course, are our kilesas, yes, which means our so-called defilements from a Buddhist perspective, and primarily the sankharas, which are the sort of formations that arise in our mind and psyche, and how they in turn interact with those around us and where we and the communities we relate to. And there are many skillful contributions that I think Western psychology and psychotherapy can offer to someone on the Buddhist path. It's near to the 5th of November, isn't it? Maybe that was a celebration of the talk, who knows. mindfulness has sort of taken a more and more prominent role. Now, the person in the West who's been credited with bringing mindfulness to the West in a really big way is a gentleman, a doctor called John Kabat-Zinn. Some of you may have heard of him. He wrote a very good book called Full Catastrophe Living, and his format that he developed in his medical school in Massachusetts was for people suffering from chronic pain. And it was an 8-week program, which is now referred to as the Mindfulness-Based Stress Relief MBSR program, which puts people through a course of mindfulness practice, essentially doing what all good Buddhists in theory do, which is observe their emotions, basically the Satipatthana Sutta practice of observing feelings and sensations, the quality of those feelings, the mental states that arise, and the contents of one's mind. But primarily focusing on body sensations, on breathing and doing body scans. And this is put into an 8-week program where people meet once a week for 2 hours, and at the end of the 8 weeks they actually spend a day retreat, in a sense, where they do some yoga and some practice, and they also discuss the effects this is having on them. And this was proved clinically in all sorts of trials as being remarkably effective in alleviating the physical pain as well as a lot of emotional pain. So it's now then was expanded and moved into the field of cognitive behavioral therapy. So now you have mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, which is MCBT, which again is a very rational analysis and essentially tries to separate the individual's identity from the content of their experience, which means that thoughts are seen as an analogy, as passing clouds that come and go, and therefore not to over-identify with the thought process and the contents of the thoughts. And this again has been proven in many studies to have a remarkably powerful effect, longer standing than using drugs in terms of dealing with things such as depression. So this, of course, has caught the imagination of many people in the West and is used increasingly not only in the therapeutic field but even in the field of business. And in fact, even the military are interested in this, and the American Army now teaches its soldiers to practice mindfulness. And there's this analogy, well, not analogy, it's actually taught to people who do things which don't really fit into the Buddhist ethical canon, such as a sniper, if he's out to shoot somebody, his breathing has to be very calm and very regular, and the ability to down-regulate emotion and fear and anxiety actually makes him a better marksman, which makes him a better killer. So that's really quite thought-provoking from a Buddhist perspective. At the same time, of course, he might actually be leading a much calmer life, and the argument against that, which is actually for mindfulness, even for soldiers, is that I'd rather deal with a mindful soldier than one who is just uncontrolled in his behavior, his anger, and his reactivity. So, of course, that raises questions which are worth reflecting on. Other forms of therapy have also taken up mindfulness as very much central to their approach, and one of them is acceptance and commitment therapy, called ACT. There's also dialectical behavioral therapy, which uses mindfulness practice in it as well. A very profound therapy developed by a woman who practiced Zen meditation and introduced some Buddhist teachings, as it were, into the practice to help people, especially borderline personality disorders, to work through their difficulties, to actually help them integrate as individuals. And I recently came across another therapy which is developed, which seems very well researched with some very interesting papers, called the self-development therapy. Now that may not quite conform with, again, the Buddhist take on the self, by emphasizing the sort of the growth of the self, but very well researched, very well thought through, emphasizing all the qualities of compassion, kindness, generosity as being key aspects of personal development in improving well-being. So generally these approaches are now referred to as mindfulness-based interventions, MBIs. At the moment in England, if you're interested in studying mindfulness, you can actually get a university degree in it. There are 25 universities where you can practice and study and train in mindfulness and end up walking out with a Master of Science in Mindfulness practice, which is very thought-provoking. There are approximately 500 papers a year produced on mindfulness, and these are research papers, really very thorough, many of them, and all highlighting the benefits of mindfulness. Now, someone like me, and I suspect some Westerners here who haven't been brought up in their childhood in a Buddhist environment, in a Buddhist culture, came to Buddhism later on in life and had to make some adaptations, be open-minded to the forms that Buddhism has taken in the East. We know that even we have Sri Lankan Buddhism, which is part of the Theravadan tradition, but of course Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, each one of those presents itself in its external forms in a different way. And for a Western mind, I was very fortunate. I didn't have to go to the East to receive all these teachings. I got the teachings here in England from some wonderful teachers to whom I'm immensely indebted and grateful. And of course, when one does go to another country, one has to adapt to the country's lifestyle and ways of doing things. So it'd be strange, driving up the M1, parking my car, having bought some petrol perhaps on the way, done some shopping to buy some dharma to offer to the monastery, and then in my Western clothes walk into another environment where I end up bowing 3 times to the shrine, 3 times to the head monk, and then perhaps joining in a puja and then chanting for half an hour or 45 minutes. And there's sort of a shift, a personality shift, what is going on here? And after a while, of course, the body adapts, the mind adapts, and I find retreats in the traditional format incredibly inspiring. I find the chanting has a very supportive effect on my emotional state, and allows my sittings to be very, very rewarding. But of course, as we, I sort of belong to a group of people who have done that, but we're not representative of that many people. There are only a few 100,000 Buddhists in this country, and yet the population, runs into millions. So when we started developing ALBA, or the Amaravati Lay Buddhist Association, the problem was that we'd get new people coming in who, of course, had the same difficulties that I and many of my colleagues had in presenting the teachings, in how to bridge this gap in terms of the external forms preventing people accessing the inner message or the central message of Buddhism. And I think that still is a tension. Some people would come onto our events or to the monastery, and they come, they have a look, and they walk away, and they just classify it as some form of mumbo-jumbo. Just can't handle either the devotional side or the incense or the bells. Some people sort of are able to put those doubting aspects to one side and actually engage in it, and with time get the benefits that comes from participating in that type of event. So the title of my talk this evening about Buddhism and secular mindfulness, friends or foes, is that there is an element of tension which I have noticed. I've been to conferences, see it in the literature, between what is put forward by a lot of very good people in the form of secular mindfulness and the more traditional Buddhist forms. And some of these arguments really get quite emotional. Now, I can understand some of that because I know that when I having been a Buddhist for so many years and quite happy to own up to it and declare myself to be a Buddhist, I suddenly found myself, instead of being isolated or just a lonely Buddhist walking down the street, more and more people are into mindfulness practice, teaching mindfulness, and it's a bit disconcerting. And I realise, I think that what can happen is that one can get quite attached to one's practice and to one's tradition. One sort of feel quite possessive about it. And I know that I felt a little bit, quite defensive sometimes, having people who have no understanding, to my mind, of Buddha Dhamma talking about mindfulness practice. There's sort of reluctance to acknowledge that they may have something to offer. And so I've gone through a sort of personal journey of somehow having to reconcile and really examine this reaction within me on the emotional level to something which essentially is proven to be good. Because when one starts thinking about it more deeply, more effectively, and less reactively, of course, mindfulness practice is about being with what is. In other words, it's coming to terms and accepting what one is experiencing in the moment. And what I've learned in my therapy practice, as well as in my teaching practice, is that that very act of acknowledging how one is feeling on the level of physical sensations, on the reactions of the body experiences when one is having an emotional reaction in response to one's thoughts or situation, the ability to stay with that and be with it in the way, as is pointed out in the Psychotherapist Sutta, actually is transformative. And paradoxically is not dependent on the teachings outside of that actual practice. And this is quite difficult to take on board because it questions many assumptions that one has. I've also come to the conclusion that actually having a perspective, as has come to us from the East, actually enriches one enormously. I find the Buddha Dhamma as expounded by Eastern teachers as just a mine of wonderful, rich diamonds and gold and jewels. It is so psychologically well-founded and so sound and solid and thought through and reflected on that I honestly just sometimes have to pause and sort of think how extraordinary that 2,500 years ago a human being actually was able to formulate the teachings based on empirical practice. It wasn't based on belief. It wasn't based on faith. Faith is understood in the sort of more theistic traditions. And I have a feeling that what we're witnessing in our society at the moment with this secular mindfulness practice is actually a gold stream of Dhamma coming through, because it's opening people up to the fact that the reality that we experience in our everyday lives is a transient reality, the teachings of anicca, which actually does explain so much as to why we suffer. And why do we suffer? Because of clinging, because of holding, yes. And those two facts alone already are pointing to a potential transformation within an individual. That instead of blaming conditions, it's analysing, looking at and experiencing the nature of those conditions and how they change. It can actually offer a vehicle for coming to terms with the nature of the way things are. Because essentially what the Buddha was pointing to was life as it is, phenomenon as it is. And it's our reaction and resistance to the way things are that is actually the cause of our suffering. Now the two things that where the two paths, secular mindfulness and Buddhist practice, are perhaps separating a little bit, is that the Buddha was very clear with this third noble truth, that actually the suffering can come to an end. And he wasn't talking about just a temporary, partial end. He was talking about an absolute end. In other words, a cessation of suffering, a complete and utter cessation of suffering, which arose out of his insight, and as he pointed out, to anybody's insight into the real nature of reality, the realization of emptiness, or shunyata, and one can say nibbana. And then what the Buddha did, he offered the Eightfold Noble Path. I've come back to the Eightfold Noble Path again and again, reflecting on it from a perspective of sort of counselling and psychotherapy. And it is so sound, so solid. It may not phrase it in the way that perhaps a Western counsellor or psychotherapist might, but essentially there is nothing to question in it. Because it starts with the actual practicalities of everyday life. It starts with our relationship to to ourselves, to what we do, how we interact with society in everyday situations, whether it be relationships, family, the way we live our lives in terms of income earning, and the sort of mechanics of everyday life in a way where certain principles are adhered to. These principles being the precepts. And again, the beautiful, open-handed way in which even the precepts are suggested that it's a training practice that we undertake voluntarily. It's not something imposed on from outside, which means that one is actually starting to take responsibility for one's actions in just everyday little things, which forms the basis, of course, of ethics and morality. Well, I have no problem in seeing that in the suffering that my patients or clients bring. And therefore, seeing the cause and effect of personal interactions where elements of greed or ignorance or anger come in, how that can impact on a relationship, on a person's well-being, can become self-evident if it's pointed out. So that's one thing which I think is easily translatable. But if we start looking at the sort of second part of the Eightfold Noble Path in terms of right effort and mindfulness, right mindfulness and samadhi, here again, I don't think secular mindfulness has gone as far as Buddhism, because of course secular mindfulness does not really include samadhi states as such. But at the same time, if one thinks of it, an individual sitting down and practicing mindfulness practice, even just focusing on the breath and focusing and paying attention to the sensations in the body, does develop a quality of tranquility, of calmness. And actually, one doesn't have to be in a belief system to have an experience where suddenly the trappings of the ego, as it were, fade away, our thinking dies down, our sense of identity dies down, and the moment that happens, our consciousness, of course, our awareness expands, and suddenly we're actually experiencing a jhana state. So jhana states are not restricted just to card-bearing Buddhists. Jhana states are open to anybody. It all depends on how one approaches them and the quality of one's attention in moments of quiet and, as it were, withdrawal from the sense phenomena of the world. And I think that most people in their practice are not on the stage of deep jhanas and wisdom, but they're more on the sort of path of morality, everyday behavior, and interaction with people, on right livelihood. I pay a lot of attention to where energy goes, where intention goes, where effort goes, and of course right effort, being very much part of the Eightfold Noble Path, is quite critical in assessing the nature of the emotions that arise and what one does with those emotions, whether one is able to resist them or withhold, restrain oneself from acting on impulses which are negative and create pain, and of course cultivating positive states of mind. And it's very interesting to see how in Western psychology now, more and more emphasis is placed on the positive psychology. In other words, emphasizing, instead of analysing the negatives, which is what a lot of Western therapy has done for the last 50 years, the attempt to sort of look at what are the factors that give rise to a sense of open-heartedness, generosity and kindness, and how immensely rewarding that can be for an individual. And in fact, I have learnt that in my own therapeutic practice, using systems such as EMDR, which you may not be familiar with, where you don't go into any of the difficult stuff until an individual is resourced with positive emotions, some kind of inner resources which allow them to generate a sense of contentment, a sense of well-being. And these practices, with no reference to any Asian teachings, involve visualization practices, using the imagination to trigger off associations which are felt in the body as being positive sensations, and giving that as a resource, offering it as a resource, so that every time negative states of mind come in with all the physical effects that has, a person has the ability to connect with what feels good in them. And that, of course, if a person feels good about themselves and with themselves, they tend to feel better about others. So one can see that actually that has an impact on how we interact in the world. So the sort of general conclusion that I'm coming to, and it's not a fixed conclusion, is that actually Buddhism and secular mindfulness can actually coexist beautifully together. I think there's going to be a dialogue between the two. I have a feeling that Buddhism will learn a lot, possibly, from the very sort of empirical approach that a lot of Westerners are taking to mindfulness practice. A lot of the research studies, point to what is more effective, what is less effective. And I think that actually secular mindfulness will be profoundly informed by Buddha Dhamma. More and more research papers are looking at specifically Buddhist terms and trying to make sense of them and actually recognizing their validity in the context of its purely scientific approach to analyzing what works for people to make them happier and better. So in a sense we could say that we are witnessing in the field of psychology and also in the arts and in fact in the broader sort of fields of human endeavour, the gradual penetration of Western society and Western values with many principles and teachings which are very, very fundamentally rooted in Buddhist teachings. And perhaps just as Buddhism moved from India into China and into sort of the surrounding areas geographically, and adapted itself to the teachings that it found there, just as it came across Taoism in China and integrated and incorporated many Taoist teachings into a sort of new form of Buddhism. The same thing happened in Tibet. Buddhism moved into Tibet, primarily from India rather than China, and actually got incorporated into teachings and traditions which come from the pre-Buddhist period, the Bon religion, with its very great emphasis on visualization practices. Going to a Buddhist, into a Tibetan temple, and it's quite different to a Sri Lankan temple or a Chinese temple for that matter. Yet at the same time, at the heart of it all are the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path. So whether one takes, I think there is something to be said for making a declaration of intent, and I think the Buddhist practice of taking the 3 refuges and 5 precepts actually is quite a significant one, because making a declaration like that has an impact on our thinking, on our present everyday consciousness. It's all very well to sort of think of, I like the idea, but actually saying verbally and commit with bodily speech and action, a commitment to practice, actually has an effect on the psyche. And of course that's what talking therapies do. They don't just rely on what you think, it's putting it into words and seeing what effect that has on oneself and on others. I actually think that one can understand the 3 refuges and 5 precepts in different ways, but one can take it very literally, that one is taking refuge in the historical Buddha, but one can also expand that and see that it's actually a metaphor for taking refuge in an enlightened mind and in an awakened mind, and just taking a refuge in that, in other words, being aware that it is potentially a possibility, that it has happened and it could happen, is already opening up the parameters of the way we interpret the world a little bit. Taking refuge in the Dhamma, if you like, one translates that as opposed to looking at it just strict Buddhist teachings. It's opening up to anything that is truthful, that points to some kind of integration, that points to some greater truth and realization. That in itself can include a whole range of books. Of course, discerning which books are good and bad, well, that applies even to Buddhist teachings. Not every book that has the Buddhist label on it is necessarily a helpful or a good book. One has to use one's own practice of discernment, and of course the Buddha encouraged that. In the Kalama Sutta, of course, he did ask that people actually question what they hear. And if one looks even at the sort of psychology of learning in Buddhist teachings. It's very straightforward, and it actually conforms to anything. No Western man or woman can deny the validity of it. You first of all hear it on the intellectual level. It's just an idea, and it belongs there. It's heard or written, and it's just an idea. But then one starts owning that idea. How does one do that? By reflecting on it, thinking about it, digesting it. How often does one hear people say, well, I'm just digesting that? They're not talking about the meal they've just had down the road. They're talking about a thought that has somehow conveyed a message which has some significance. Well, that digestion process is actually trying to incorporate it, reflecting on what it might mean. And then, of course, the third stage of learning is when it suddenly becomes an, oh, yes, I really do understand. When we say that, aha, I really do understand, what has happened? It's been fully taken in. It's actually become part of one's system. We're not separate from it in any way. And that actually points to what an insight is. We may know all the theories of the Buddha's teachings, but it's only when it's actually embodied. In other words, when the body is pure. What does that mean? That's a word I can't use in my therapy. But purifying the body means recognizing all those negative states of mind, all those attachments, all that stickiness that prevents us being clear. There's a correspondence between feeling clear in the body and feeling clear in the mind. When we're really clean and clear, there's a sense of lightness, a sense of energy, an ability to relate to the world, to relate to oneself, which actually is enabling, which allows one to live with the flow of life, as opposed to being in conflict. And every time one does come into conflict, instead of going into a reactive mode, there's a sort of slight stepping back perhaps. What's happening here? That ability to step back from a conflict and just pause, breathe, notice what's happening. Well, whether one's a Buddhist or a non-Buddhist, it's got to be a good thing. So at the end of the day, we can be foes and we can be enemies in terms of secular mindfulness and Buddhist practice. My hope is that we'll become friends, because essentially that's the way to peace and well-being, not only individually but collectively as well. So those are sort of my initial reflections. I could go on for a very long time, but I'd also like to open up with the floor so it's not just a one-sided monologue. So I'm very happy to take some questions. I don't know how we are for time. Yeah, it might be a good time to take a few questions perhaps if anybody has any, and I'll expand a little bit more. I could go on for a very long time when I get